Hello again,
Hello again.
and welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, and today we're talking about the Disney eras. Now, I'm sure that anybody who's really heard much of anything about Disney animation at all knows kind of roughly what the Disney eras are. So I'm going to go through a brief overview of what they are known to be as, just to catch anybody up who needs a little bit of a refresher. But then I'm going to spend the bulk of this video talking about how I actually think that they should be slightly redefined and renamed, and that maybe a couple of extra eras need to be added here and there for a little bit more nuance and just sort of a better system of classifying the films that more lines up with how the history of the company actually went overall. So anyway, without further ado, let's get into our little recap of how the eras are generally defined. First up is the Golden Era, which started with Snow White and lasted from 1937 through 1942, and the 5 releases in the Golden Era were Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Bambi, and Dumbo. The second era began in 1943 and ran through 1949. 6 films were released in this period. All were a combination of 2 or more shorts, and it has become known as the wartime or package film era, as they were all package films and they were all released either in or just after World War II. And the films in this era were Saludos Amigos, The Three Caballeros, Make Mine Music, Fun and Fancy Free, Melody Time, and The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. The third era is generally known as the Silver Age. It lasted from 1950 through 1967, and it started with, of course, the film that saved Disney animation, Cinderella, and then on to Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, Sleeping Beauty, 101 Dalmatians, Sword in the Stone, and The Jungle Book. And this was the era after World War II in which Walt Disney was still at the helm of the company, and ends with The Jungle Book because he passed away just a few months before it was released. The next era, the fourth, generally thought of Disney era, is known as the Bronze Age, and it lasts from 1968, or really 70 with their next release, through 1988. It is a very long period, and it comprises 8 different films, just as the last era did. So the Golden had 5, Wartime had 6, Silver had 8, and the Bronze after it has 8 releases as well. The releases in this era were the Aristocats, Robin Hood, The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, The Rescuers, The Fox and the Hound, The Black Cauldron, The Great Mouse Detective, and Oliver and Company. This era was known for sort of rougher animation and darker storylines and darker, literally, animation as well, sort of peaking with The Black Cauldron in 1985 in terms of the sheer darkness. The next era is the most well-known and celebrated, the 5th, other than the Golden Age, and that's, of course, the Disney Renaissance, which began in 1989 and ran through 1999, comprising 10 releases, starting with The Little Mermaid and then going on to The Rescuers Down Under, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Hercules,
Honey, you mean Hercules!
Mulan, and Tarzan. And this was a period, of course, where Disney was at a creative and financial, the box office combined all-time high in terms of success for both together. And it was just it was a boom period. Disney animation was booming. Pixar began booming in the mid-90s as well. It was just a time when animated film was really, really reaching a peak. You know, Ghibli did some great stuff in the 90s. It was just what a time for animated film releases. So anyway, that's the Renaissance and the sixth era. This next era is known as the post-Renaissance. It starts at the tail end of 1999 and then goes through 2008. And the releases in this era were Fantasia 2000, Dinosaur, The Emperor's New Groove, Atlantis, The Lost Empire, Lilo and Stitch, Treasure Planet, Brother Bear, Home on the Range, Chicken Little, Meet the Robinsons, and Bolt. So if you're keeping count, keeping score, the Renaissance had 10 releases, and then this post-Renaissance era had 11. So, in its original counting. So that was number 6. The next era, number 7, is what's generally known as the Revival era, beginning in 2009 and running through 2016. The releases in this era were The Princess and the Frog, Tangled, Winnie the Pooh, Wreck-It Ralph, Frozen, Big Hero 6, Zootopia, and Moana. And this era was characterized by, very similar to the Renaissance, a lot of big hits and a lot of princess movies or princess-type films. So that's number 7, and then the 8th era, which we are currently in, doesn't really have an officially agreed-on name yet, but I've heard people call it the sequels and streaming era, sort of interchangeably or together. So let's just say it's the sequels and streaming era for now, because it's been the era in which they started Disney Plus, and it's been the era in which they've produced the most sequels, as you'll see in a moment. And the movies released in this 8th era of Disney animation are Ralph Breaks the Internet, Frozen. God, what a movie to start on. Jeez Louise. Anyway.
Oh, hi. Thanks for checking in. I'm still a piece of garbage.
Frozen 2, Raya and the Last Dragon, Encanto, Strange World, Wish, Moana 2, and Zootopia 2. So, 4 sequels in this era and counting, with at least 3 more announced, actually, if we're going with... there's going to be 2 more Frozens and at least 1 more Zootopia, so yeah. 3 sequels announced and 4 in this era already. Oh, I'm exhausted. Anyway, sequel fatigue. So that's the brief recap of the 8 conventionally known Disney eras, but now I'm going to give you what I and Lydia have come up with. Lydia, a friend of the channel, collaborator on the channel.
You can learn a lot from Lydia.
And she and I have discussed the Disney eras in depth, and we've come up with a new system for categorizing the movies. There are now 9 eras. There aren't actually as many as I thought. I thought there were like 11 or something. I can't remember. I don't know why I thought we'd added something like 3, but no, we just added 1 extra one. We've split 1 era into 2, and we've also elongated 1 era. You'll see anyway. We've redrawn the lines a bit, and there's also some transition films, as we'll get into. I think there's at least 3 transitional films that are sort of part of one era and part of another. But one thing we wanted to do was get away from the gold, silver, and bronze sort of naming convention for the first, third, and fourth eras, because for one thing, they don't even sync up in the timeline. They're 1, 3, and 4, and just it implies a certain hierarchy, and I, for one, I mean, personally, I prefer what's known as the Silver Era to what's known as the Golden Era. And I know a lot of people do. And it's just, I don't know. I just think that the Gold, Silver, Bronze thing is sort of outdated, and we can do better now. And it implies a certain hierarchy that it doesn't need to imply, because we don't need to be ranking these eras as we are sort of talking about them. We just need to be using them as descriptive, accurate categories. So, anyway, the first era, instead of golden, we're going to obviously keep the lines the same, 1937 to 42, because those releases all make sense as a category before the war. The original 5. And so we're going to title that, instead of golden, the Origins era, or the Disney Origins era for longer. All of these eras will have longer and then shorter names. 1-word names and then slightly, longer phrase names. But the first one is going to be the Disney Origins era from 1937 to 42. The next era, we're going to keep the lines of exactly the same, and because, of course, it is the package film era. They are the 6 package films in a row. The only other package films they've ever made are Adventures of Winnie the Pooh and the 2 Fantasias, but these 6 are a set. And we're actually going to keep the wartime name, or package name, because it's just kind of perfect. It doesn't need to be messed with. There's a couple of other names that we're going to keep the same because they are just already very fitting. But we've changed, I think, a little bit over half of them. So for us, it goes Origins, Wartime, and then number 3, we are changing from the Silver Era. We're going to keep the lines about the same, from 50 to 67, but we are going to now call it the Dreamer Era, or as I like to call it, as I have in a few videos before, the era of Walt's final dreams, because they're all the films that Walt had been wanting to make for decades, pretty much all since the 1930s, except for the one that is based on new material, 101 Dalmatians. But yeah, the era of Walt's final dreams, and this is the one where the studio had enough money and enough resources and enough know-how after the war, with Walt still in charge, to be making these really consistent in quality, really beautiful, really imaginative movies that were all pretty dang good adaptations of either classic fairy tales or classic literature, like Alice and Peter are. And so, yeah, it's a really, really good era. I think that Dreamer era does fit it a lot better than Silver. So that's number 3. Number 4, and now we get to our first transitional film. Now I'm actually right in the middle of this part of my Dear series, which is my main series of reviews of each of the Disney films on the channel. If you're watching this video, you've probably seen 1 or 2 of those, if not most of them. So I'm working on the Aristocats right now. I've got it all written and filmed, and it's one of my favorites. It's a great, great, great movie. But Lydia and I were discussing this, and it's sort of a bit of a bridge film, a transition between the Dreamer era from 50 to 67 and really into 70 with the Aristocats, and it's a bleed-over film into the next era, which we call the Revamp era. So we're changing this next era drastically. Usually, and this has always been my biggest problem with the era's classification, is this one in particular. For one thing, it's called the Bronze Age, and I hate that name because it implies that it's worse than the other 2. And even if it might be weaker in quality overall, it's still a great era. But it's also called the Disney Dark Age, and it's just sort of thought of as a sort of a time when Disney animation wasn't doing well financially or critically or quality-wise. And I think even if it wasn't doing great financially, I think a lot of banger films are still in this era, especially the Aristocats and Robin Hood and a couple of others. But basically what we're doing is we're splitting this one up into 2. Because usually it runs from 1970 through 1988, which is 8 releases, like the previous one, but it's not nearly as consistent because for the previous era, from 50 to 67, Walt was alive and in charge for that entire time. Whereas from 70 through 88, you have a big transition. You transition from Wolfgang Reitherman being the heir to Walt, being the head of Disney Animation. And then by the end of Fox and the Hound, he's pretty much gone. And that's 1981. And then by 1988, and then going into the Renaissance next, but with Oliver and Company coming out in 1988, and even by the mid-80s, you had Jeffrey Katzenberg in charge of Disney Animation in the stead of old retired Wolfgang Reitherman, and you had Michael Eisner in charge of Disney overall. And
Hello?
so it was an extremely different team that was in charge in 1988 versus 1970, whereas in 1967 you had dozens and dozens and dozens of the same people who were working in 1950. So it was a hugely transformational era, and that's why Lydia and I have chosen to break it up into 2. And so I'm going to have basically 3 transitional films. I think there start to be a lot of transitional films here in between Disney eras, rather than them being so clearly delineated as they were for their first 3. So the Aristocats is a bleed-over film, and it goes from the Dreamer era into the Revamp era, and of course this era from 1970 to 81, which comprises now only 5 releases: Robin Hood, The Rescuers, Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, and then The Fox and the Hound. This is the era in which all of the rest of the 9 old men were retiring. Some of the 9 old men and many of the guys who had worked under Walt had retired by the 70s, but the ones who were still there, like Wolfgang Reitherman and Eric Larson, they remained through, and Frank and Ollie, I think, were there still too. And they remained through the 1970s, and a couple of them, their last work was on The Fox and the Hound. So I would say The Fox and the Hound is then the transitional film from the revamp era into the next one, which we have still called the Dark Era. And we're calling it the Dark Era, the Dark Age, because it was literally dark. It is actually sort of the darkest visual time in Disney history, animation-wise. And so we are going to be comprising that one of just the 5 films that were released in the 80s. And that's because The Little Mermaid is another transitional film. Because then this is kind of an animation technique thing. But basically, xerography had begun being used in 1961 in place of the more expensive full painted cell animation that they'd done before that up through Sleeping Beauty. But they cut costs starting in 1961 with 101 Dalmatians doing xerography, and then they used xerography up through a little bit through into the 1980s. And you can see a lot of it still in those 1980s films, but it was hugely used through the 60s and 70s, especially in the 70s. But basically, by 1990, The Rescuers Down Under was the first film that was entirely animated using the CAPS system of animation, and that's just short for Computer Animation Production System. So, very, the CAPS system is just calling it the system, basically, is the S on the end. So, you just call it CAPS. But yeah, it was the first film entirely using CAPS to be animated, where so entirely in a computer. Whereas The Little Mermaid still had some of those old 2D techniques still being used on it, so you can see the real difference there between sort of it and Rescuers Down Under. So that's why it's definitely a part of the Renaissance, but it is also a bit of just the films of the 80s too, and the way they look a little bit rougher still. So those 5 films released in the 80s are collectively the Dark Era, with the end of the Nine Old Men in the Fox and the Hound, and then The Black Cauldron, The Great Mouse Detective, Oliver and Company, and then the transition of The Little Mermaid into the next era, which is the Disney Renaissance, of course. Now, we've kept the name Renaissance partially just because it's so iconic. Nobody's ever going to stop using Renaissance, but we might maybe convince people to stop using gold and silver and bronze someday. But yeah, the Disney Renaissance as a name is here to stay. But what we've done is we think that there is a transitional film on either end of it, starting with The Little Mermaid, and that it is a little bit longer than people like to usually count it as. But I think there's a really good case to be made that it extends all the way through 2002. So, rather than splitting the last long era up into 2 shorter eras that have some bleed-over films, the Renaissance we're actually going to extend into... let me see, how many are we adding onto it? 6 films. We're taking the 10 releases of the Renaissance and we're adding 6 films more to it. So, yeah, it's a 16-film era. But also, it makes sense because so many of the same artists were working, again, in 1989 and still in 2002. Musker and Clements, just for 2. Wise and Truesdale worked all the way almost through that, too. And so... again, a lot of this is based on the creatives behind the films rather than just sort of arbitrary points in time to stick a pin in. And so Lydia and I felt like this was a lot more sensical to think about it as the people making the films and how that delineates the era rather than just, I don't know, just kind of box office success essentially kind of really delineates it, the current eras. And also we like the idea of crossover films and transitional films, bleed over. So the Renaissance for us now extends from The Little Mermaid through 2002, and Treasure Planet is now the transitional film, and I'll tell why. And I'll tell you for why.
And I'll tell you for why.
So it extends now, Tarzan isn't the last one, it now goes through Fantasia 2000, Dinosaur, yeah, now by our rules, Dinosaur is part of the Disney Renaissance, shoot me. Lydia actually really likes Dinosaur. Not really, maybe. I don't know. Maybe that's a mischaracterization, but she does like it. And I don't. But we'll get to that later. But never mind that now. However, basically, what it is I think it's really silly to cut off the movies in the early 2000s, specifically the 4 straight releases of The Emperor's New Groove, Atlantis, The Lost Empire, Lilo and Stitch, and Treasure Planet, because I think not only are all 4 of these films incredibly high in quality, they all have massive followings or cult followings today, even if they weren't big hits at the time, but also one of them were big hits at the time. Obviously, Treasure Planet was a big flop, but Atlantis did, not awful at the box office. And then, The Emperor's New Groove did okay. And Lilo and Stitch was a huge franchise starter and continues to be a gold mine for Disney today. So if, your metric also is financial success, I do think that the financial success did extend through 2002 with the success of Lilo and Stitch. If you count Lilo and Stitch as, a movie in the Renaissance, if Lilo and Stitch had come out in 1999, it would be considered part of the Renaissance. It's good enough, and it was a financial hit and became a huge franchise with a bunch of sequels and a TV show and a live-action remake that made $1 billion and a sequel coming to that now. Anyway, get away from me. Sequel coming to that now, whatever. But that's why we extended through 2002, and then Treasure Planet is the transitional film into the next era because Treasure Planet, while still incredibly high quality-wise, it was a massive bomb because it came out on the same day as Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, and Disney did that on purpose to tank it, to teach Musker and Clements a lesson. But never mind that now. Anyway. Treasure Planet's the transitional film, so the Renaissance is now 16 movies long, 1989 through 2002, because so many of the same artists were working on all of these films anyway. And it was the same sort of creative teams behind the movies in the early 2000s as was in the mid-90s. And so Treasure Planet then becomes the first film of the next era, which we have changed from the post-Renaissance to the transitional era. And we decided on this one because this is the era in which they were transitioning creative teams from the 90s and early 2000s through to the people who would eventually be making up the revival in the 2010s. And so this was a big shift of creative talent, a lot of people retiring or moving on to do their own projects or other studios. And even more so, it was the transition from 2D to fully 3D. There was only 2 more 2D films after this era, and so this was the last gasp. And this was the first era in which they were making fully 3D animated movies, because even though Dinosaur did have 3D animation in it, and a lot of the films from the 90s had 3D animation in it, Dinosaur also had live action settings and backgrounds in it, and the other films had 2D. Whereas the first all 3D film that Disney ever produced was Chicken Little in 2005. They did Meet the Robinsons, they did Bolts, and then Tangled in the next era. So it starts with Treasure Planet at the end of 2002, then Brother Bear, then Home on the Range, then Chicken Little, then Meet the Robinsons, and then Bolts. So 6 films from 2002 through 2008. And then, of course, the next era we've once again kept the revival, as we just think it's a really good description of this era, and also it's a name that's become popular and probably going to be pretty hard to change people's minds about it now. But yes, the revival we've kept the same, and it goes from 2009. And it starts with The Princess and the Frog, and it goes through 2016 with the release of Moana. And so this was an era characterized by princesses, and it was a kind of a Renaissance 2.0, basically. Princesses galore, huge box office successes, new strides in animation, pretty much with every film, with the 3D animation getting better and better and better. And it just went through 2016, and all of the films were also pretty much creative and critical hits too. They were all successes almost in every facet in some way you can make the case for. So this was just a make hay while the sun shine era, and revival's a fitting name, so we're keeping it. The next era, however, we are changing from either sequels or streaming or sequels and streaming, and we are giving it the moniker of the Legacy era. This one that stretches from Ralph Breaks the Internet through, so far, Zootopia 2. And because this era already has 4 sequels under its belt, and it's going to have a few more by the time it's done, so we feel like Legacy is a nicer way of saying that it's basically playing on the past of the studio. And even a film like Wish, which I really like, but even it is, of course, a reinterpretation of, in a way, retelling of many of the studio's earlier stories, and it's even an origin story for some of them. And so this era has so much been playing on nostalgia and playing on the successes of the past, and that's why we feel like, not negative or positive, but just descriptive, the Legacy era is an apt title. And so I'll just go through them once more one by one, so you can see them in the line of the graphic. So our 9 new eras, new and old, but the 9 eras that Lydia and I have come up with are the Origins era, the Wartime era, the Dreamer era, the Revamp era, the Dark era, the Renaissance era, the Transitional era, the Revival era, and the Legacy era. And that's all 9 of them. We felt like that was a better set of names than what we've all sort of culturally been collectively using for a long time. So, maybe it'll catch on, maybe it won't, but we think that that's a nicer set, and that's the set of names that I'm going to try to start using pretty much full-time going forward on the channel, just because I think they're better. So, I'll also be referencing the sort of accepted eras as well, just to explain a little bit, but I'll start using my names too. So look out for that if you're a regular watcher, but more so than that, if you're still here, thank you ever so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this video. This was just another sort of off-the-cuff one that Lydia and I planned in terms of format, but I've just sort of improv, and I'm glad I did that because I came up with some thoughts in the moment that I wouldn't have otherwise. So anyway, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe, try to get me over 1,000. I'm really close, and I want to get there. So please, please, please do. Hope to see you again soon, and if you're still here, good night, good luck, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
That's all.